Chapter 2, we're in it. Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism. To introduce this chapter, I thought it may be wise to play a proto-fascist 10-minute book chapter, just to identify the type of fascism propaganda currently being distributed to intellectual conservatives in this day and age, in 2020. The book, which I'm going to play chapter 7 from, is written by the author Julius Evola. The title of the book is Metaphysics of War, in the publishing house, which you can check out on YouTube as well as the internet, any social media platform like BitChute or Odyssey, is Arctos Media. So we'll begin with Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Love, work, and knowledge are the wellsprings of our life. They should also govern it.
Army as vision of the world. Undoubtedly, the new fascist generation already possesses a broadly military, warlike orientation. But it has not yet grasped the necessity of integrating the details of simple discipline and psychophysical training into a superior order, a general vision of life. The ethical aspect. One begins to see this when one studies our ancient traditions, which, certainly not by chance, so often used as symbolism taken from fighting, serving and asserting oneself heroically to express purely spiritual realities. The group of initiates was called stratos, or army, in Orphism. Miles expressed a degree of the Mithraic hierarchy. Symbols of agony always recur in the sacred representations of classic Romanity, and passed, in part, to Christian asceticism itself. But here we shall deal with something more precise than mere analogies, namely the related doctrine of holy war, of which we have spoken previously in our books, as well as in these pages. We shall confine ourselves to the ethical field and refer to a special and central attitude calculated to bring about a radical change of meaning in the whole field of values, and to raise it to a plane of manliness, separating it completely from all bourgeois attitudes, humanitarianism, moralism, and limp conformism. The basis of this attitude is summed up in Paul's well-known phrase, vita est militia super terra. It is a matter of conceiving the being here below as having been sent in the guise of a man on a mission of military service to a remote front. The purpose of this mission not always being directly sensed by the individual, in the same manner that one who fights in the outposts cannot always form a precise idea of the overall plan to which he contributes, but in which inner nobleness is always measured by the fact of resisting, of accomplishing, in spite of all, what must be accomplished, in the fact of not doubting nor hesitating, in the fact of a fidelity stronger than life or death. The first results of this view are an affirmative attitude with respect to the world, assertion, and, at the same time, a certain freedom. He who is really a soldier is so by nature, and therefore, because he wants to be so, in the missions and tasks which are given to him, consequently, he recognizes himself, so to speak. Likewise, the one who conceives his existence as being that of a soldier in an army will be very far from considering the world as a vale of tears from which to flee, or as a circus of irrational events at which to throw himself blindly, or as a realm for which carpe diem constitutes the supreme wisdom. Though he is not unaware of the tragic and negative side of so many things, his way of reacting to them will be quite different from that of all other men. His feeling that this world is not his fatherland, and that it does not represent his proper condition, so to speak, his feeling that basically he comes from afar, will remain a fundamental element which will not give rise to mystical escapism and spiritual weakness, but rather will enable him to minimize, to relativize, to refer to higher concepts of measure and limit, all that can seem important and definitive to others, starting with death itself, and will confer on him calm force and breadth of vision. The social aspect. The military conception of life, then, leads to a new sense of social and political solidarity. It goes beyond all humanitarianism and socialism. Men are not our brothers, and our neighbor is in a way an insolent concept. Society is neither a creature of necessity nor something to be justified or sublimated on the basis of the ideal of honeyed universal love and obligatory altruism. Every society will instead be essentially conceived in the terms of the solidarity existing between quite distinct beings, each one determined to protect the dignity of its personality, but nevertheless united in a common action which binds them side by side, without sentimentalism, in male comradeship. Fidelity and sincerity, with the ethics of honor to which they give rise, will thus be seen as the true basis of every community. According to ancient Indo-Germanic legislation, killing did not appear to be as serious a fault as betrayal, or even mere lying. A warlike ethics would also lead to more or less this attitude, and it would be inclined to limit the principle of solidarity by means of those with dignity and affinity. The soldier can regard as comrades only those whom he holds in esteem and who are resolute to hold their posts, not those who give way, the weak or the inept. Besides, has the duty of gathering and pushing forward the valid forces, rather than wasting them on concern and lament for those who have already fallen, or have yielded, or have landed themselves in cul-de-sac. Sense of Stoicism. However, the views we put forward here are most valuable in terms of inner strengthening. Here we enter in the field of a properly Roman ethics, with which the reader should already be familiar through those excerpts from classical authors which are published on a regular basis in the diorama. As we have stated previously, we speak here of an inner exchange, by virtue of which one's reactions towards facts and life experiences become absolutely different, and, rather than being negative, as they are generally, become positive and constructive. Stoic Romanity offers us an excellent insight into this, provided that it is known as it really was, as true and indomitable life affirmation, far from the preconceived opinions which endeavor to make us see in the Stoic only a stiffened, hardened being become foreign to life. Can one really doubt this when Seneca affirms the true man as superior to a god, since, while the latter is protected by nature from misfortune, man can meet the latter, challenge it, and show himself superior to it? Or when he calls unhappy those who have never been so, since they have never managed to know or to measure their force. In these authors precisely one can find many elements for a warlike system of ethics, which revolutionizes completely the common manner of thinking. A very characteristic aspect of this viewpoint is this. The one who is sent off to a dangerous place curses his fate only if he's a vile person. If he is a heroic spirit, he is instead proud of it, since he knows that his commander chooses the worthiest and strongest for any risky mission, and for any post of responsibility, leaving the most convenient and secure posts only to those whom he basically does not hold in esteem. This same thought is appropriate to the most dark, tragic, discouraging moments of life. It is necessary to discover in these either a hidden providentiality or an appeal to our nobility and superiority. Who is worthy of the name of man and of Roman, Seneca writes precisely. Who does not want to be tested and does not look for a dangerous task? For the strong man, inaction is torture. There is only one side able to command the attention, even of a god, and it is that of a strong man battling with bad luck, especially if he himself challenged it. This is a wisdom, besides which is taken from ancient ages, and finds a place even in the general conception of the history of the world. If Hesiod, before the spectacle of the Age of Iron, the dark and deconsecrated age which is identified as the last age, exclaimed, "If only then I did not have to live in the Age of Iron, but could have either died first or been born afterwards." A teaching peculiar to the ancient Indo-Germanic traditions was that precisely those who, in the Dark Age, resist in spite of all will to be able to obtain fruits, which those who lived in more favorable, less hard periods could seldom reach. Thus, the vision of one's life as membership within an army gives shape to an ethic of its own, and to a precise inner attitude which arouses deep forces. On this basis, to seek membership in an actual army, with its disciplines and its readiness for absolute action on the plane of material struggle, is the right direction and the path which must be followed. It is necessary to first feel oneself to be a soldier in spirit, and to render one's sensibility in accordance with that, in order to be able to do this also in a material sense subsequently, and to avoid the dangers which, in the sense of a materialistic hardening and overemphasis on the purely physical, can otherwise come from militarization on the external plane alone. Whereas, given this preparation, any external form can easily become the symbol and instrument of properly spiritual meanings. A fascist system of ethics, if thought through thoroughly, cannot but be directed along those lines. Scorn for the easy life is the starting point. The further points of reference must still be placed as high as possible, beyond everything which can speak only to feeling, and beyond all mere myth. If the two most recent phases of the involuntary process which has led to the modern decline are first, the rise of the bourgeois, and second, the collectivism not only of the idea of the state, but also of all values and of the conception of ethics itself, then to go beyond all this, and to reassert a warlike vision of life in the aforementioned full sense, must constitute the precondition for any reconstruction. When the world of the masses and of the materialistic and sentimental middle classes gives way to a world of warriors, the main thing will have been achieved, which makes possible the coming of an even higher order, that of true traditional spirituality. Race and war.
There we have one chapter, The Metaphysics of War, a proto-fascist book written by Julius Evola. Interesting. Getting back into Wilhelm Reich, we're at chapter 2. Just going to push through this. It was pretty interesting, the first chapter. Chapter 2, the authoritarian ideology of the family in the mass psychology of fascism, begins on page 34. 2.1, Furor and mass structure. 2.2, Hitler's background. 2.3, on the mass psychology of the lower middle class. 2.4, family ties and nationalistic feelings. 2.5, nationalistic self-confidence. 2.6, the domestication of the industrial workers. And we will end chapter 2 on page 75. So it's about 35 pages. Lovely. 2. The authoritarian ideology of the family in the mass psychology of fascism. Furor and mass structure. If at some future date the history of social processes would allow the reactionary historian time to indulge in speculations on Germany's past, he would be sure to perceive in Hitler's success in the years between 1928 and 1933 the proof that a great man makes history only inasmuch as he inflames the masses with his idea. In fact, National Socialist propaganda was built upon this Furor ideology. To the same limited extent to which the propagandists of National Socialism understood the mechanics of their success, they were able to comprehend the historical basis of the National Socialist movement. This is very well illustrated by an article published at that time entitled, quote, "Christianity and National Socialism," close quote, written by the National Socialist Wilhelm Staple. He stated, quote, "For the very reason that National Socialism is an elementary movement, it cannot be gotten at with arguments. Arguments would be effective only if the movement had gained its power by argumentation." Close quote. In keeping with this peculiarity, the rally speeches of the National Socialists were very conspicuous for their skillfulness in operating upon the emotions of the individuals and the masses, and of avoiding relevant arguments as much as possible. In various passages in his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, Hitler stresses that true mass psychological tactics dispense with argumentation and keep the masses' attention fixed on the great final goal at all times. What the final goal looked like after the seizure of power can easily be shown by Italian fascism. Similarly, Göring's decrees against the economic organization of the middle classes, the rebuff to the quote-unquote second revolution, which was expected by the partisans, the failure to fulfill the promised socialist measures, etc., revealed the reactionary function of fascism. The following view shows just how little Hitler himself understood the mechanism of his success. Quote, "This broadness of outline from which we must never depart, in combination with steady, consistent emphasis, allows our final success to mature. And then, to our amazement, we shall see what tremendous results such perseverance leads to results that are almost beyond our understanding." Hitler's success, therefore, could certainly not be explained on the basis of his reactionary role in the history of capitalism. For this role, had it been openly avowed in his propaganda, would have achieved the opposite of that which was intended. The investigation of Hitler's mass psychological effect has to proceed from the presupposition that a Führer, or the champion of an idea, can be successful, if not in a historical, then at least in a limited perspective, only if his personal point of view, his ideology, or his program bears a resemblance to the average structure of a broad category of individuals. This leads to the question, to what historical and sociological situation do these mass structures owe their genesis? And so the line of questioning of mass psychology is shifted from the metaphysics of the Führer idea to the reality of social life. Only when the structure of the Führer's personality is in harmony with the structures of broad groups can a Führer make history. And whether he makes a permanent or only a temporary impact on history depends solely upon whether his program lies in the direction of progressive social processes or whether it stems them. Hence, one is on the wrong scent when one attempts to explain Hitler's success solely on the basis of the demagogy of the National Socialists, the befrogging of the masses, quote unquote, their quote unquote deception, or to apply the vague, hollow term, quote unquote, Nazi psychosis, as the communists and other politicians later did. There's a note, footnote 1, chapter 2, Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, translated by Ralph Mannheim, Houghton Mifflin Company, Boston, 1943, page 185. For it is precisely a question of understanding why the masses prove to be accessible to deception, be fogging in a psychotic situation. Without a precise knowledge of what goes on in the masses, the problem cannot be solved. To assert that the Hitler movement was a reactionary movement is not enough. The NSDAP's mass success is inconsistent with this supposed reactionary role, for why would millions upon millions affirm their own suppression? Here is a contradiction that can be explained only by mass psychology, and not by politics or economics. National Socialism made use of various means in dealing with various classes, and made various promises depending upon the social class it needed at a particular time. In the spring of 1933, for example, it was the revolutionary character of the Nazi movement that was given particular emphasis in Nazi propaganda in an effort to win over the industrial workers, and the 1st of May was celebrated, but only after the aristocracy had been appeased in Potsdam. To ascribe the success solely to political swindle, however, would be to become entangled in a contradiction with the basic idea of freedom, and would practically exclude the possibility of a social revolution. What must be answered is, why do the masses allow themselves to be politically swindled? The masses had every possibility of evaluating the propaganda of the various parties. Why didn't they see that, while promising the workers that the owners of the means of production would be disappropriated, Hitler promised the capitalists that their rights would be protected? Hitler's personal structure and his life history are of no importance whatever for an understanding of National Socialism. It is interesting, however, that the lower middle class origin of his ideas coincide in the main with the mass structures, which eagerly accepted these ideas. As is done in every reactionary movement, Hitler relied upon the various strata of the lower middle class for his support. National Socialism exposes all the contradictions that characterize the mass psychology of the petty bourgeois. Now it is a question of 1. Comprehending the contradictions themselves, and 2. Getting an insight into their common origin in the conditions of imperialistic production. We will restrict ourselves to questions of sex ideology. 2.2. Hitler's background. The Furor of the German middle class in revolt was himself the son of a civil servant. He tells of a conflict which is especially characteristic of a middle-class mass structure. His father wanted him to become a civil servant, but the son rebelled against the paternal plan, resolved on no account to obey, became a painter, and fell into poverty in the process. Yet, alongside this rebellion against the father, the respect for and acceptance of his authority continued to exist. This ambivalent attitude toward authority, rebellion against it coupled with acceptance and submission, is a basic feature of every middle-class structure from the age of puberty to full adulthood, and is especially pronounced in individuals stemming from materially restricted circumstances. Hitler speaks of his mother with great sentimentality. He assures us that he cried only once in his life, namely when his mother died. His rejection of sex and his neurotic idolization of motherhood are clearly evident in his theory on race and syphilis, see next chapter. As a young nationalist who lived in Austria, Hitler resolved to take up the fight against the Austrian dynasty, which had abandoned the German fatherland to Slavization. In his polemics against the Habsburgs, the reproach that there were several syphilitics among them assumes a conspicuous position. One would not pay any further attention to this factor if it were not the idea of the poisoning of the nation and the whole attitude toward the question of syphilis are brought up again and again, and later, after the seizure of power, constitute a central part of his domestic policies. In the beginning, Hitler sympathized with the Social Democrats because they led the fight for universal suffrage, and this might have brought about a weakening of the Habsburger regime, which he despised. But Hitler was repelled by social democracy's emphasis on class differences, their negation of the nation, the authority of the state, the private ownership of the social means of production, of religion, and morals. What finally caused him to turn away from the Social Democrats was the invitation to join the Union. He refused and justified his refusal with his first insight into the role of social democracy. Bismarck becomes his idol, because it was he who had brought about the unification of the German nation and had fought against the Austrian dynasty. The anti-Semite Luger and the German national Schoner play a decisive role in shaping Hitler's further development. From now on, his program is based on nationalistic, imperialistic aims, which he intends to compass with different, more suited means than those used by the old bourgeois nationalists. The means he chooses are determined by his recognition of the effectiveness of organized Marxism's power, by his recognition of the importance of the masses for every political movement. Some quotes. Not until the international worldview, politically led by organized Marxism, is confronted by a folkish worldview, organized and led with equal unity, will, success, supposing the fighting energy to be equal on both sides, fall to the side of eternal truth. Adolf Hitler, page 384, Mein Kampf. Page 385, quote, what gave the international worldview success was its representation by a political party organized into storm troops. What caused the defeat of the opposite worldview was its lack up to now of a unified body to represent it. Not by unlimited freedom to interpret a general view, but only in the limited and hence integrating form of a political organization can a worldview fight and conquer. Albert. Close quote. Wilhelm Reich continues, page 38. Hitler soon recognized the inconsistency of the social democratic policies and the powerlessness of the old bourgeoisie parties, including the German National Party. All this was only the necessary consequence of the absence of a basic new anti-Marxist philosophy endowed with a stormy will to conquer. Page 173. Mein Kampf. The more I occupied myself with the idea of a necessary change in the government's attitude towards social democracy as the momentary embodiment of Marxism, the more I recognized the lack of a serviceable substitute for this doctrine. What would be given the masses if, just supposing, social democracy had been broken? There was not one movement in existence which could have been expected to succeed in drawing into its sphere of influence the great multitudes of workers grown more or less leaderless. It is senseless and more than stupid to believe that the international fanatic who had left the class party would now at once join a bourgeoisie party, in other words, a new class organization. Page 173. The bourgeois parties, as they designated themselves, will never be able to attach the proletarian masses to their camp, for here two worlds oppose each other, in part naturally and in part artificially divided, whose mutual relation can only be struggle. The younger will be victorious, and this is Marxism, page 174. National Socialism's basic anti-Soviet attitude was evident almost from the beginning. Quote, if land was desired in Europe, it can be obtained by and large only at the expense of Russia, and this meant that the new Reich must again set itself on the march along the road of the Teutonic knights of old, to obtain by the German sword sod for the German plow and daily bread for the nation. Page 140. Hitler saw himself confronted with the following questions. How is the National Socialist idea to be carried to victory? How is Marxism to be combated effectively? How is one to get to the masses? These questions in mind, Hitler appeals to the nationalistic feelings of the masses, decides, however, to develop his own technique of propaganda and to employ it consistently, thus organizing on a mass basis as Marxism had done. Hence, what he wants, and it is openly admitted, is to implement nationalistic imperialism with methods he has borrowed from Marxism, including its technique of mass organization. But the success of this mass organization is to be ascribed to the masses and not to Hitler. It was man's authoritarian, freedom-fearing structure that enabled his propaganda to take root. Hence, what is important about Hitler sociologically does not issue from his personality, but from the importance attached to him by the masses. And what makes the problem all the more complex is the fact that Hitler held the masses, with whose help he wanted to carry out his imperialism, in complete contempt. Instead of giving many examples and substantiation of this, let one candid confession suffice. Quote, "The mood of the people was always a mere discharge of what was funneled into public opinion from above." Close quote. How were the structures of the masses constituted that they were still capable of imbibing Hitler's propaganda despite all this? 2.3 on the mass psychology of the lower middle class. We have stated that Hitler's success is to be ascribed neither to his personality nor to the objective role his ideology played in capitalism. Nor, for that matter, is it to be ascribed to a mere befogging of the masses who followed him. We put our finger on the core of the matter. What was going on in the masses that they followed a party whose leadership was objectively as well as subjectively in diametrical opposition to the interests of the working masses? In answering this question, we must first of all bear in mind that in its first successful onset, the National Socialist movement relied upon the broad layers of the so-called middle classes. An example, the millions of private and public officials, middle-class merchants, and lower and middle-class farmers. From the point of view of its social basis, National Socialism was a lower middle-class movement, and this was the case wherever it appeared, whether in Italy, Hungary, Argentina, or Norway. Hence, this lower middle class, which was formerly on the side of the various bourgeois democracies, must have gone through an inner transformation causing it to change its political position. The social situation and its corresponding psychological structure in the lower middle classes offer an explanation of the basic similarities as well as differences between the ideology of the liberal bourgeoisie and the fascists. Fascism's lower middle class is the same as liberal democracy's lower middle class, only in a different historical epoch of capitalism. In the election years of 1930 to 1932, National Socialism polled its new votes almost exclusively from the German National Party and the smaller faction parties of the German Reich. Only the Catholic Center maintained its position, even in the Prussian election of 1932. It wasn't until the later election that National Socialism also succeeded in making an incursion into the masses of industrial workers. The middle class was and continued to be the mainstay of the swastika. And it was this class championing the cause of National Socialism which stepped onto the political tribunal and halted the revolutionary reconstruction of society during the most severe economic convulsion of the capitalist system, which it had experienced from 1929 to 1932. Political reaction's assessment of the middle class's importance was absolutely correct. In a leaflet of the German National Party of April 8, 1932, we read, quote, "The middle class is of decisive importance for the existence of a state." Close quote. After January 30th, 1933, the question of the social importance of the middle class was widely discussed by the left. Until then, the middle class was given far too little attention, partly because all interests were focused on the development of political reaction and the authoritarian leadership of the state, and partly because a line of questioning based on the psychology of the masses was foreign to the politicians. From now on, the rebellion of the middle class was given more and more prominence in various places. In following the discussion of this question, one noted two principal views. The one contended that fascism was nothing other than the party guard of the upper middle class, and the other did not overlook this fact, but stressed the rebellion of the middle classes, with the result that the exponents of this view were accused of obliterating the reaction within the role of fascism. In substantiation of this accusation, one cited the nomination of Thyssen as economic dictator, the dissolution of the middle class economic organizations, the rebuff to the Second Revolution. In short, fascism's unadulterated reactionary character, which from about the end of June 1933 became more and more evident and pronounced. Certain obscurities were evident in these very heated discussions. The fact that after the seizure of power, National Socialism showed itself more and more to be an imperialistic nationalism, which was intent upon eliminating everything socialistic from the movement and preparing for war with every available means, did not contradict the other fact that fascism, viewed with respect to its mass basis, was actually a middle-class movement. Had he not promised to take up the fight against big business, Hitler would never have won the support of the middle classes. They helped him to achieve victory because they were against big business. Owing to the pressure they exerted, the authorities were forced to adopt anti-capitalist measures, just as the authorities were later forced to abandon them under the pressure applied by big business. If the subjective interests in the mass basis of a reactionary movement are not distinguished from the objective reactionary function, the two contradict one another but were reconciled in the totality of the Nazi movement in the beginning. It is not possible to reach an understanding. The former pertains to the reactionary interests of the fascist masses, while the latter pertains to the reactionary role of fascism. All its contradictions originate in the antithesis of these two sides of fascism, just as their reconciliation in the one form, National Socialism, characterizes the Hitler movement. Insofar as National Socialism was forced to stress its character as a middle-class movement before the seizure of power and right afterward, it was in fact anti-capitalist and revolutionary. However, since it did not deprive big business of its rights and had to consolidate and hold on to the power it had secured, its capitalistic function was brought more and more into the foreground until finally it became an extreme advocate and champion of imperialism and the capitalist economic order. In this respect, it is wholly immaterial whether and how many of its leaders had an honest or dishonest socialist orientation in their sense of the word, and it is just as immaterial whether and how many were out-and-out deceivers and power mongers. A radical anti-fascist policy cannot be based on these considerations. Everything necessary for an understanding of German fascism and its ambivalence could have been learned from the history of Italian fascism, for the latter also showed these two strictly contradictory functions reconciled in a totality. Those who either deny the function of the mass basis of fascism or fail to give it its proper due are stupefied by the fact that the middle class, since it neither possesses the principal means of production nor works with them, cannot really be a permanent motive force in history, and for that reason must oscillate between capital and the workers. They fail to see that the middle class can be and is, quote unquote, a motive force in history. If not permanently, then at least temporarily, as we learned from Italian and German fascism. By this we mean not only the crushing of the workers' organizations, the countless sacrifices, the eruptions of barbarism. Over and above this, it prevents the economic crisis from developing into a political upheaval, into a social revolution. Clearly, the greater the extent and the importance of a nation's middle-class strata, the more decisive is their significance as an effective social force. From 1933 to 1942, we are confronted with the paradox that fascism was able to outstrip social revolutionary internationalism as an international movement. The socialists and the communists were so certain about the progress of the revolutionary movement in relation to that of political reaction that they committed outright political suicide, even if motivated by the best of intentions. This question deserves the greatest of attention. The process that has taken place in the middle-class strata of all countries during the last decade deserves far greater attention than the banal, all too well-known fact that fascism constitutes extreme political reaction. The mere fact of fascism's reactionary nature is no basis for an effective counter-political policy, as was amply shown by the events of 1928 and 1942. The middle class got up in the movement and made its appearance as a social force in the form of fascism. Therefore, it is not a question of Hitler or Göring's reactionary purpose, but a question of the social interests of the middle class strata. Owing its character structure, the middle class has a social power far in excess of its economic importance. It is the class that preserves nothing less than several thousand years of patriarchy and keeps it alive with all its contradictions. That a fascist movement exists at all is doubtlessly the social expression of nationalistic imperialism. However, that this fascist movement could become a mass movement, indeed, could seize power, only then fulfilling its imperialistic function, is to be ascribed to the full backing it received from the middle class. Only by taking these antitheses and contradictions into account, each in its turn, can the phenomena of fascism be comprehended. The social position of the middle class is determined by, first, its position in the capitalist production process. Second, its position in the authoritarian state apparatus. And third, its special family situation, which is directly determined by its position in the production process and is the key to an understanding of its ideology. There are indeed differences in the economic situation of the small farmers, the bureaucrats, and the middle-class businessmen, but the basic nature of their family situation is the same. The rapid development of capitalist economy in the 19th century, the continuous and rapid mechanization of production, the amalgamation of the various branches of production in monopolistic syndicates and trusts, form the basis of the progressive pauperization of the lower middle-class merchants and tradesmen. Not capable of competing with the cheaper and more economically operating large industries, the small enterprises go to ruin, never to recover. The middle class has nothing but ruthless annihilation to expect from the system. This is the issue. Whether we shall all sink into the great gray bleakness of proletarianism, where we shall all have the same thing, namely nothing, or whether energy and diligence shall again put the individual in a position to acquire property by hard work, middle class or proletarian, that is the issue. So the German nationals warned before the election of the president of the Republic in 1932. The National Socialists were not so blunt. They were careful not to create a wide gap between the middle class and the body of industrial workers in their propaganda, and they were more successful with their approach. The fight against the large department stores played a large role in the propaganda of the NSDAP. The contradiction between the role played by National Socialism for big business and the interests of the middle class, from which it derived its main support, was expressed in Hitler's talk with Knickerbocker. Quote, "You will not make German-American relations dependent upon a haberdasher shop." The reference is to the fate of the Woolworth store in Berlin. The existence of such enterprises are an encouragement of Bolshevism. They destroy many small enterprises. For that reason, we will not sanction them, but you can rest assured that your enterprises of this nature in Germany will be dealt with no differently than similar German enterprises. Footnote 2, page 45. Following the seizure of power in the months of March and April, masses of people plundered the department stores, but the NSDAP leadership soon put a stop to this. Interdiction against autocratic interference in the economy, dissolution of middle-class organizations, etc. Private business debts to foreign countries were an enormous burden to the middle class. Since his foreign policy was dependent upon the fulfillment of foreign claims, Hitler was for the payment of these private debts. His followers, however, demanded that they be annulled. Thus, the lower middle class rebelled, quote unquote, against the system, by which it understood the Marxist regime of social democracy. Footnote, page 46. By identification, psychoanalysis understands the process whereby a person begins to feel at one with another person, adopts that person's characteristics and attitudes, and in his fantasy puts himself in the other's place. This process entails an actual change in the identifying person, inasmuch as the latter internalizes characteristics of his model. Reich continues. As much as these lower middle class strata were urged, under the stress of the crisis, to form organizational alliances, the economic competition of the small enterprises nonetheless operated against the establishment of a feeling of solidarity corresponding to that of the industrial workers. As a consequence of his social situation, the lower middle class man could join forces neither with his social class nor, for that matter, with the industrial workers, not with his own class because competition is the rule there, not with the industrial workers because it is precisely proletarianization that he fears most of all. And yet the fascist movement brought about an alliance of the lower middle class. What was the basis of this alliance in the psychology of the masses? The answer to this is supplied by the social position of the lower and middle class public and private officials. The economic position of the average official is worse than that of the average skilled industrial worker. This poorer position is partially compensated by the meager prospect of a career, and in the case of the government official, by a lifelong pension. Thus, dependent upon governmental authority, a competitive bearing toward one's colleagues prevails in this class, which counteracts the development of solidarity. The social consciousness of the official is not characterized by the fate he shares with his coworkers, but by his attitude to the government and to the nation. This consists of a complete identification with the state power. In the case of the company employee, it consists of an identification with the company. He is just as submissive as the industrial worker. Why is it that he does not develop a feeling of solidarity as the industrial worker does? This is due to the intermediate position between authority and the body of manual laborers. While subordinate to the top, he is to those below him a representative of this authority and enjoys, as such, a privileged moral, not material, position. The arc personification of this type in the psychology of the masses is to be found in the army sergeant. Bustlers, valets, and other such employees of aristocratic families are a flagrant example of the power of this identification. A flagrant example of the power of this identification. By adopting the attitudes, way of thinking, and demeanor of the ruling class, they undergo a complete change and, in an effort to minimize their lowly origin, often appear as caricatures of the people whom they serve. This identification with authority, firm, state, nation, etc., which can be formulated, I am the state, the authority, the firm, the nation, constitutes a psychic reality and is one of the best illustrations of an ideology that has become a material force. At first, it is only the idea of being like one's superior that stirs the mind of the employee or the official. But gradually, owing to his pressing material dependence, his whole person is refashioned in line with the ruling class. Always ready to accommodate himself to authority, the lower middle class man develops a cleavage between his economic situation and his ideology. He lives in materially restricted circumstances, but assumes gentlemanly postures on the surface, often to a ridiculous degree. He eats poorly and insufficiently, but attaches great importance to a decent suit of clothes. A silk hat and a dress coat become the material symbol of this character structure. And nothing is more suited for a first impression appraisal of the mass psychology of a people than its dress. It is its accommodating attitude that specifically distinguishes the structure of the lower middle class man from the structure of the industrial worker. Footnote 4, page 47. This applies only to Europe. The adaptation of the lower middle class habits by the industrial worker in America obliterates the boundary between the two. How deep does this identification with authority go? We know already that such an identification exists. The question, however, is how, apart from the economic existential conditions which affect him directly, emotional factors reinforce and consolidate the lower middle class man's attitude to such an extent that his structure does not waver in times of crisis or even in times in which unemployment destroys the immediate economic base. We stated above that the economic positions of the various strata of the lower middle class are different, but that the basic features of their family situation are the same. It is in this family situation that we have the key to the emotional foundation of the structure that we described earlier. Section 2.4, Family Ties and Nationalistic Feelings. In the beginning, the family situation of the various strata of the lower middle class is not differentiated from the immediate economic position. The family, those of officials excluded, also constitutes an economic enterprise on a small scale. The members of a small merchant's family work in his business, thus eliminating the expense of outside help. On small and medium farmsteads, the coinciding of family and mode of production is even more pronounced. The economy of the great patriarchs, the Zagruda, for instance, is essentially built upon this practice. In the close interlacing of family and economy lies the key to the question why the peasantry is bound to the earth, traditional, and for that reason so accessible to the influence of political reaction. This does not mean to say that it is solely the economic mode of existence that determines the attachment to the earth and tradition, but that the farmer's mode of production entails a strict family tie of all members of the family, and that this tie presupposes a far-reaching sexual suppression and repression. It is from this double base, then, that the typical peasant way of looking at things arises. Its core is formed by patriarchal sexual morality. Elsewhere, I described the difficulties encountered by the Soviet government in the collectivization of agriculture. It was not only the love of the soil, but first and foremost the family tie conditioned by the soil that created such difficulties. A quote from Adolf Hitler, page 138, Mein Kampf, quote, "For one thing, the possibility of preserving a healthy peasant class as a foundation for a whole nation can never be valued highly enough. Many of our present-day sufferings are only the consequence of the unhealthy relationship between rural and city population. A solid stock of small and middle peasants has at all times been the best defense against social ills such as we possess today. And, moreover, this is the only solution which enables a nation to earn its daily bread within the inner circuit of its economy. Industry and commerce recede from their unhealthy leading position and adjust themselves to the general framework of a national economy of balance, supply, and demand. That was the position taken by Hitler. As senseless as it is economically speaking, as little as political reaction could ever succeed in checking the mechanization of big agriculture and the dissolution of agriculture on a small scale, this propaganda was nonetheless significant from the standpoint of mass psychology, for it had an effect on the close-knit family structure of the lower middle-class strata. The close interrelation between family tie and rural forms of economy was finally expressed by the NSDAP after the seizure of power, since, with respect to its mass basis and ideological structure, the Hitler movement was a lower middle-class movement. One of its first measures intended to secure the middle classes was the edict issued on May 12, 1933, on the new order of agriculture ownership, which reverted to age-old legal codes based on the indissoluble unity of blood and soil. A few characteristic passages are appended here. The indissoluble unity of blood and soil is the indispensable presupposition for a nation's health. In Germany, rural legislation of past centuries also gave legal guarantees to this tie born of a nation's natural feelings of life. The farmstead was the unsaleable inheritance of the ancestral peasant family. Later, non-native legislation was imposed and destroyed the legal basis of this rural constitution. In many parts of the country, nonetheless, the German peasant, having a healthy sense of his people's basic conception of life, persevered in the old custom, handing down the farmstead from generation to generation. It is the imperative duty of the government of an awakened people to guarantee the national awakening by legal regulation of the indissoluble unity of blood and soil preserved by German custom through the law of entail. The owner of a farmstead or forestry who is registered as the heir to entail property in the competent district court must pass on his property in accordance with the law of entail. The owner of this inherited farm is called a farmer. A farmer cannot own more than one farm inherited under this law. Only one of the farmer's children is allowed to take over the inherited farm. He is the legal inheritor. The co-inheritors will be provided for by the farmstead until they are economically independent. If through no fault of their own they fall into straitened circumstances, they also have the right to seek refuge at the farmstead in later years. The transfer of a non-registered farmstead, which is nonetheless qualified for registration, is governed by the law of entail. An entail inherited farmstead can be owned only by a farmer who is a German citizen and of German blood. Only he who has no one among his male ancestry or other ancestry of Jewish or colored origin for 4 generations is of German blood. Clearly, however, every Teuton is of German blood according to the letter of this law. A marriage with a person of non-German blood permanently excludes the offspring of this marriage from being the owner of a farmstead inherited under this law. The purpose of this law is to protect the farmsteads against heavy indebtedness and harmful fragmentation in the process of inheritance, and to preserve it as the permanent inheritance of the families of free farmers. At the same time, the law aims at a healthy distribution of the agricultural land. A large number of self-sufficient small and medium farmsteads spread throughout the country as evenly as possible is necessary for the preservation of estates and people's health. What tendencies are expressed in this law? It was at variance with the interests of big agriculture, which was intent upon absorbing the medium and small farmsteads and creating an ever-widening division between landowner and propertyless rural proletariat. But the frustration of this intent was amply compensated by the preservation of the rural middle class. in which big agriculture had a considerable interest in view of the fact that it represented the mass basis of its power. It is not only as a private owner of property that the small landowner is identified with the large landowner. By itself, this would not mean very much. What is important here is the preservation of the ideologic atmosphere of the small and medium property owners, that atmosphere, namely, that exists in small enterprises operated by a family unit. It is this atmosphere that is known to produce the best nationalistic fighters and to imbue the women with nationalistic fervor. And this explains why political reaction is always prattling about the morality-preserving influence of the peasantry. However, this is a sex economic question. This interlacing of individualistic modes of production and authoritarian family in the lower middle class is one of the many sources of the fascist ideology of the large family. This question will return later in another context. The economic pitting of the small businesses against one another corresponds to the family encapsulation and competition typical of the lower middle class. Notwithstanding the fascist ideology, common welfare comes before personal welfare and corporate idea. The basic elements of fascist ideology, Furor principle, family policy, etc., have an individualistic character. What is collective in fascism stems from the socialistic tendencies in the mass basis, as the individualistic elements stem from the interests of big business and the fascist leadership. In view of man's natural organization, this economic and family situation would break down if it were not secured by a specific relationship between man and woman, a relationship we designate as patriarchal, and a mode of sexuality derived from this specific relationship. Economically, the urban middle-class man is not in a better position than the manual laborer. Thus, in his efforts to differentiate himself from the laborer, he must rely essentially on his family and sexual modes of life. His economic deprivations have to be compensated for in a sexual, moralistic way. In the case of the official, this motive is the most effective element of his identification with the ruling power. Since one is not on a plane with the upper middle class, but is nonetheless identified with it, these sexual moralistic ideologies have to compensate for the economic limitations. Essentially, the sexual modes of life and the cultural modes of life dependent upon them serve to differentiate him from the lower classes. The sum total of these moralistic attitudes, which cluster around one's attitude towards sex and are commonly designated as Philistine, culminate in notions of, not acts of, honor and duty. The effect of these two words on the lower middle class must be correctly assessed, otherwise it will not serve much purpose to concern ourselves with them. They appear again and again in the fascist dictator ideology and race theory. Actually, it is precisely the middle class's way of life, its business practices, that impose a completely opposite behavior. A touch of dishonesty is part of the very existence of private merchandising. When a peasant buys a house, he runs it down in every possible way. If he sells the same horse a year later, it will have become younger, better, and stronger. Allow me to reread this. The sum total of these moralistic attitudes, which cluster around one's attitude towards sex and are commonly designated as Philistine, culminate in notions of, not acts of, honor and duty. The effect of these two words on the lower middle class must be correctly assessed, otherwise it will not serve much purpose to concern ourselves with them. They appear again and again in the fascist dictator ideology and race theory. Actually, it is precisely the lower middle class's way of life, its business practices, that impose a completely opposite behavior. A touch of dishonesty is part of the very existence of private merchandising. When a peasant buys a horse, he runs it down in every possible way. If he sells the same horse a year later, it will have become younger, better, and stronger. One's sense of duty is molded by business interests and not by national character traits. One's own commodity will always be the best, the other person's always the worst. Depreciation of one's competitors, a depreciation that is usually devoid of all honesty, is an essential tool of one's quote-unquote business. The small businessman's obsequious and differential behavior toward his customers testifies to the fierce pressure of economic existence, which has to warp the best character in the long run. Nevertheless, the concepts of honor and duty play a very decisive role in the life of the lower middle class. This cannot be explained solely on the basis of efforts to conceal one's crude materialistic background. For despite all hypocrisy, the ecstasy derived from the notions of honor and duty is genuine. It is merely a question of its source. This ecstasy stems from sources of unconscious emotional life. One does not pay much attention to these sources at first, and one is only too happy to overlook their relation to the above ideology. However, an analysis of lower middle class people leaves no doubt about the importance of the relation between sexual life and the ideology of duty and honor. For one thing, the political and economic position of the father is reflected in his patriarchal relationship to the remainder of the family. In the figure of the father, the authoritarian state has its representative in every family, so that the family becomes its most important instrument of power. The authoritarian position of the father reflects the political role and discloses the relation of the family to the authoritarian state. Within the family, the father holds the same position that his boss holds toward him in the production process, and he reproduces subservient attitude toward authority in his children, particularly in his sons. Lower middle class man's passive and servile attitude toward the Furor figure issues from these conditions. Without really divining it, Hitler was building upon this lower middle class attitude when he wrote, quote, Mein Kampf, page 183, "The people, in their overwhelming majority, are so feminine by nature and attitude that sober reasoning determines their thoughts and actions far less than emotion and feeling. And this sentiment is not complicated, but very simple and all of a piece. It does not have multiple shadings. It has a positive and a negative, love or hate, right or wrong, truth or lie, never half this way and half that way, never partially or that kind of thing." This is not a question of an inherent disposition, but of a typical example of the reproduction of an authoritarian social system in the structures of its members. What this position of the father actually necessitates is the strictest sexual suppression of the woman and the children. While women develop a resigned attitude under lower middle class influence, an attitude reinforced by repressed sexual rebellion, the sons, apart from a subservient attitude toward authority, develop strong identification with the father, which forms the basis of the emotional identification with every kind of authority. How it comes about that the psychic structures of the supporting strata of a society are so constructed that they fit the economic framework and serve the purposes of the ruling powers as precisely as the parts of a precision machine will long remain an unsolved riddle. At any rate, what we describe as the structural reproduction of a society's economic system in the psychology of the masses is the basic mechanism in the process of the formation of political ideas. It is only much later that the attitude of economic and social competition contributes to the development of the structure of the lower middle class. The reactionary thinking that is shaped at this stage is a secondary continuation of psychic processes that reach back into the first years of a child raised in an authoritarian family atmosphere. For one thing, there is the competition between the children and the grown-ups, but of far-reaching consequence, there is the competition among children of the same family in their relationship to the parents. In childhood, this competition, which later in adulthood and in life outside the family is predominantly an economic one, is mainly operative in the strong emotional love-hate relationships among members of the same family. This is not the place to pursue these relationships in detail. This is a field of study by itself. Let it suffice to say here, the sexual inhibitions and debilitations that constitute the most important prerequisites for the existence of the authoritarian family and are the most essential groundwork of the structural formation of the lower middle class man are composed with the help of religious fears, which are infused with sexual guilt feelings and deeply embedded in the emotions. Thus, we arrive at the problem of the relation of religion to the negation of sexual desire. Sexual debility results in a lowering of self-confidence. In one case, it is compensated by the brutalization of sexuality, and the other by rigid character traits. The compulsion to control one's sexuality, to maintain sexual repression, leads to the development of pathologic, emotionally tinged notions of honor and duty, bravery and self-control. But the pathology and emotionality of these psychic attitudes are strongly at variance with the reality of one's personal behavior. The man who attains genital satisfaction is honorable, responsible, brave, and controlled without making much of a fuss about it. These attitudes are an organic part of his personality. The man whose genitals are weakened, whose sexual structure is full of contradictions, must continually remind himself to control his sexuality, to preserve his sexual dignity, to be brave in the face of temptations, etc. The struggle to resist the temptation to masturbate is a struggle that is experienced by every adolescent and every child without exception. All the elements of the reactionary man structure are developed in this struggle. It is in the lower middle class that this structure is reinforced most strongly and embedded most deeply. Every form of mysticism derives its most active energy and, in part, also its content from this compulsory suppression of sexuality. And so far as the various categories of industrial workers are subject to the same social influences, they too develop corresponding attitudes. Yet, owing to the distinct difference in their way of life compared with the lower middle class, sex-affirming forces are far more pronounced in them and also more conscious. The effective anchoring of these structures by means of unconscious anxiety, their concealment by character traits that appear completely asexual, are responsible for the fact that these deep layers of the personality cannot be reached with rational arguments alone. What importance this statement has for practical sex politics will be discussed in the last chapter. Footnote 5, page 55. Die Moral der Kraft by the National Socialist Ernst Mann is an especially informative book for the recognition of these relationships. Wilhelm Reich continues. To what extent the unconscious struggle against one's own sexual needs gives rise to metaphysical and mystical thinking cannot be discussed in detail here. We will mention only one example, which is typical of the National Socialist ideology. Again and again, we run across series such as this: personal honor, family honor, racial honor, national honor. This sequence is consistent with the various layers in the individual structure. However, it fails to include the socioeconomic basis, capitalism, or rather patriarchy, the institution of compulsive marriage, sexual suppression, personal struggle against one's own sexuality, personal compensatory feeling of honor, etc. The highest position in this series is assumed by the ideology of national honor, which is identical with the irrational core of nationalism. To understand this, however, it is necessary to turn aside from our main theme again. Authoritarian societies fight against the sexuality of children and adolescents, and the consequent struggle in one's own ego takes place within the framework of the authoritarian family, which has thus far proven to be the best institution to carry out this fight successfully. Sexual desires naturally urge a person to enter into all kinds of relations with the world, to enter into close contact with it in a vast variety of forms. If they are suppressed, they have but one possibility: to vent themselves within the narrow framework of the family. Sexual inhibition is the basis of the familial encapsulation of the individual, as well as the basis of individual self-consciousness. One must give strict heed to the fact that metaphysical, individual, and familial sentimental behavior are only various aspects of one and the same basic process of sexual negation, whereas reality-oriented, non-mystical thinking moves along with a loose attitude toward the family and is at the very least indifferent to ascetic sexual ideology. Footnote 6, page 56. Hence, the Oedipus complex, which Freud discovered, is not so much a cause as it is the result of the sexual restrictions imposed upon the child by society. Yet, wholly unconscious of what they are doing, the parents carry out the intentions of authoritarian society. What is important in this connection is that the tie to the authoritarian family is established by means of sexual inhibition, that it is the original biological tie of the child to the mother and also of the mother to the child that forms the barricade to sexual reality and leads to an indissoluble sexual fixation and to an incapacity to enter into other relations. The tie to the mother is the basis of all family ties. In their subjective emotional core, the notions of homeland and nation are notions of mother and family. Among the middle classes, the mother is the homeland of the child, just as the family is the nation in miniature. This will enable us to understand why the National Socialist Goebbels chose the following words as the motto for his 10 Commandments in the National Socialist Almanac of 1932, doubtlessly without knowledge of its deeper connotation. Quote, "Never forget that your country is the mother of your life." Close quote. On the occasion of Mother's Day 1933, Angriff stated, "Mother's Day. The national revolution has swept away everything petty. Ideas lead again and lead together. Family, society, nation. The idea of Mother's Day is perfectly suited to honor that which the German idea symbolizes. The German mother. Nowhere does this importance devolve upon the wife and the mother as it does in New Germany. She is the protectress of the family life from which sprout the forces which will again lead our nation forward. She, the German mother, is the sole bearer of the idea of the German nation. The idea of mother is inseparable from the idea of being German. Is there anything which can lead us closer together than our mutual honoring of the mother?" No matter how false these sentences are economically and socially speaking, they are true from the point of view of human structure. Thus, nationalistic sentiments are the direct continuation of the family tie and are likewise rooted in the fixated tie to the mother. This cannot be explained biologically, for this tie to the mother, insofar as it develops into a familial and nationalistic tie, is itself a social product. In puberty, it would make room for other attachments, an example, natural sexual relations, if sexual restrictions would not cause it to be eternalized. It is as this socially motivated eternalization that it becomes the basis of nationalist feelings in the adult. It is only at this stage that it becomes a reactionary social force. If the nationalist sentiments of the industrial worker are far less pronounced than those of the lower middle class worker, it is to be ascribed to the different social life and consequent looser family ties of the former. Now, I hope no one will get upset and reproach us with wanting to biologize sociology, for we know perfectly well that the difference in the industrial worker's family life is also determined by his position in the production process. The question must be asked, nonetheless, why it is that the industrial worker is clearly accessible to internationalism, whereas the lower middle class worker has such a strong leaning toward nationalism. In the objective economic situation, this factor of diversity can be ascertained only when the above described connection between the industrial worker's economic and familial situation is taken into account. It cannot be ascertained in any other way. The strange refusal on the part of Marxist theorists to regard family life as a factor of equal importance as far as the anchoring of the social system is concerned, indeed to regard it as the decisive factor in the formation of the human structure, is to be traced back to their family ties. The fact that the family tie is the most intense and the most emotional cannot be overrated. Footnote 8, page 58. He who has not freed himself from his own tie to his family and to his mother, or who has not at least clarified and excluded their influence from his judgments, should not seek to investigate the formation of ideology. He who would want to dismiss these facts as Freudian would only give proof of his scientific cretinism. One should argue and not chatter without possessing special knowledge. Freud discovered the Oedipus complex. Revolutionary family politics would be impossible without this discovery. But Freud is just as far from such an assessment and sociological interpretation of the family formation as the mechanistic economist is from a comprehension of sexuality as a social factor. Let it be proven that the dialectical materialism has been incorrectly used, but facts that every worker knew before Freud discovered the Oedipus complex would not be refuted. And fascism is to be destroyed not with slogans but with knowledge. Errors are possible and can be corrected, but scientific obtuseness is reactionary. Wilhelm Reich continues on page 9. The essential connection between familial and nationalistic ideology can be pursued further. Families are just as cut off from and opposed to one another as nations are. In both cases, the ultimate basis for the separation and opposition is an economic one. The lower middle class family, those of officials, lower income white collar workers, etc., is continually harassed by food and other material worries. Hence, the large lower middle class families' expansion tendencies also reproduce an imperialistic ideology. The nation needs space and food. It is for this reason that the lower middle class man is especially accessible to imperialistic ideology. He is capable of fully identifying with the personified conception of the nation. It is in this way that familial imperialism is ideologically reproduced in national imperialism. Goebbels' statement, printed in the brochure Die Verfluchen Heiken Kreuzler, Herr Verlag, Munich, page 16 and 18, is of interest in this connection. It was written in answer to the question whether a Jew is a man. Quote, if someone cracks a whip across your mother's face, would you say to him, thank you? Is he a man too? One who does not such a thing is not a man, he is a brute. How many worse things has the Jew inflicted upon our mother Germany, and still inflicts upon her? He, the Jew, has debauched our race, sapped our energy, undermined our customs, and broken our strength. The Jew is the graphic demon of decay, begins his criminal butchery of people. Close quote. Wilhelm Reich continues. One has to know the importance of the idea of castration as punishment for sexual pleasure. One has to comprehend the sexual psychological background of fantasies of ritual murder, as well as the background of anti-Semitism as such. And moreover, one has to appraise correctly these sexual guilt feelings. and sexual anxieties of the reactionary man to be able to judge just how unconsciously written sentences impinge upon the unconscious emotionality of the average reader. It is in such statements and their unconscious emotional impact that we find the psychological roots of National Socialism's anti-Semitism. There was supposed to be nothing but befogging, certainly befogging also, but it was overlooked that ideologically fascism was the resistance of a sexually as well as economically deadly sick society to the painful but resolute revolutionary tendencies towards sexual as well as economic freedom, a freedom the very thought of which instills the reactionary man with mortal terror. That is to say, the establishment of economic freedom goes hand in hand with the dissolution of old institutions, particularly those governing sexual policies, to which the reactionary man and also the industrial worker, insofar as he is a reactionary, are not immediately equal. More than anything, it is the fear of sexual freedom, conceived as sexual chaos and sexual dissipation in the mind of the reactionary thinker, which has a retarding effect upon the yearning to be free of the yoke of economic exploitation. This will be the case only as long as this misconception of sexual freedom prevails, and it can continue to prevail only in consequence of the lack of clarity surrounding these very decisive questions in masses of people. It is precisely for this reason that sex economy must play an essential role in the ordering of social relations. The more extensively and deeply the reactionary structure has taken hold of the toiling masses, the more decisive is the importance of the sex economic work of educating the masses of the people to assume social responsibility. In this interplay between economic and structural factors, it is the authoritarian family that represents the foremost and most essential source of reproduction of every kind of reactionary thinking. It is a factory where reactionary ideology and reactionary structures are produced. Hence, the safeguarding of the family, example of the authoritarian and large family, is the first cultural precept of every reactionary policy. This is what is essentially concealed behind the phrase, quote, safeguarding of the state, culture, and civilization, close quote. An NSDAP election proclamation for the presidential election of 1932, Adolf Hitler Mein Programme, stated, quote, by virtue of her nature and destiny, woman is man's mate. Thus, both man and woman are companions in life as well as companions in work. Just as the economic development over the centuries has changed man's sphere of work, it is only logical that it has also changed woman's sphere. Over and above the necessity of working together, it is man and woman's duty to preserve man himself. In this most noble mission of the sexes, we also discover the basis of their individual talents, which Providence, in its eternal wisdom, gave to both of them immutably. Thus, it is the highest and companions. Allow me to reread. By virtue of her nature and destiny, woman is man's mate. Thus, both man and woman are companions in life as well as companions in work. Just as the economic development over the centuries has changed man's sphere of work, it is only logical that it has also changed woman's sphere. Over and above the necessity of working together, it is man's and woman's duty to preserve man himself. In this most noble mission of the sexes, we also discover the basis of their individual talents, which Providence, in its eternal wisdom, gave to both of them immutably. Thus, it is the highest task to make the founding of a family possible to the mates in life and companions in work. Its final destruction would mean the end of every form of higher humanity. No matter how far a woman's sphere of activity can be stretched, the ultimate aim of a truly organic and logical development must always be the creation of a family. It is the smallest but most valuable unit in the complete structure of the state. Work honors both man and woman, but the child exalts the woman. Under the heading, Preservation of the Peasantry means the preservation of the German nation, the same proclamation states, quote, in the preservation and encouragement of a healthy peasantry, I further see the best safeguard against social woes as well as against the racial decay of our people, close quote. In this respect, the traditional family tie of the peasantry must not be forgotten if one does not want to make an error. It continues. It is my belief that, to build up its resistance, a people must not live solely in accordance with rational principles. It also needs spiritual and religious support. The poisoning and disintegration of the national body by the events of our cultural Bolshevism are almost more disastrous than the effect of political and economic communism. As a party that, as Italian fascism, owed its initial success to the interests of big landowners, the NSDAP had to win over the small and medium farmers, had to establish a social basis for itself in them. In this, naturally, it could not openly promote the interests of big landowners in its propaganda, but had to direct its appeal to the small farmers, specifically to the structures produced in them by the overlapping of the family and economic situation. Only with respect to this element of the lower middle class is the sentence valid that man and woman are companions in work. It does not apply to the body of industrial workers. Even to the peasant, it applies only formally, for in reality the peasant's wife is the peasant's servant. The prototype and realization of the fascist ideology of the hierarchic organization of the state is to be found in the hierarchic organization of the peasant family. The peasant family is a nation in miniature, and every member of this family is identified with this miniature nation. Thus, the groundwork for the absorption of a grand imperialistic ideology is present in the peasantry and in the lower middle class, where an entire family is engaged in a small enterprise. The idolization of motherhood is conspicuous in both cases. How is this idolization related to reactionary sexual politics? Two point five. Nationalistic self-confidence. In the individual structures of the masses of the lower middle class, national and familial ties coincide. These ties are especially intensified by a process that not only runs parallel to it, but is actually derived from it. From the standpoint of the masses, the nationalistic furor is the personification of the nation. Only insofar this furor actually personifies the nation in conformity with the national sentiments of the masses does a personal tie to him develop. Insofar as he knows how to arouse emotional family ties in the individuals of the masses, he is also an authoritarian father figure. He attracts all the emotional attitudes that at one time were meant for the strict but also protecting and impressive father, impressive in the child's eyes. In discussions with National Socialist enthusiasts about the untenability and contradictoriness of the NSDAP program, one often heard it said that Hitler understood all of that much better. Quote, he would manage everything all right, close quote. Here we have a clear expression of the child's need for the protective attitude of the father. In terms of social reality, it is this need for protection on the part of the masses of the people that enables the dictator to, quote unquote, to manage everything. This attitude on the part of the masses of people impedes social self-administration. For example, irrational independence and cooperation. No genuine democracy can or should build upon it. Even more essential, however, is the identification of the individuals in the masses with the Führer. The more helpless the mass individual has become owing to his upbringing, the more pronounced is his identification with the Führer, and the more the childish need for protection is disguised in the form of a feeling at one with the Führer. This inclination to identify is the psychological basis of national narcissism, an example of the self-confidence that individual man derives from the greatness of the nation. The reactionary lower middle class man perceives himself in the Führer, in the authoritarian state. On the basis of this identification, he feels himself to be a defender of the national heritage of the nation, which does not prevent him, likewise, on the basis of this identification, from simultaneously despising the masses and confronting them as an individual. The wretchedness of his material and sexual situation is so overshadowed by the exalting idea of belonging to a master race and having a brilliant Führer that, as time goes on, he ceases to realize how completely he has sunk to a position of insignificant, blind allegiance. The worker who is conscious of his skills, he, in short, who has rid himself of his submissive structure, who identifies with his work and not with the Führer, with the international working masses and not the national homeland, represents the opposite of this. He feels himself to be a leader, not on the basis of his identification with the Führer, but on the basis of his consciousness of performing work that is vitally necessary for society's existence. What are the emotional forces that are at work here? This is not difficult to answer. The emotions by which this fundamentally different mass psychological type is motivated are the same as those that are to be found in the nationalists. It is merely the content of that which excites the emotions that is different. The need to identify is the same, but the objects of identification are different, namely fellow workers and not the Führer, one's own work and not an illusion, the working men of the earth and not the family, in short, international consciousness of one's skills as opposed to mysticism and nationalism. But this certainly does not imply a neglect of the liberated worker's self-confidence. It is the reactionary man who begins to rave about service to the community, and general welfare comes before personal welfare at a time of crisis. It merely implies that the self-confidence of the liberated worker is derived from the consciousness of his skills. During the past 15 years, we have been confronted with a fact which is difficult to comprehend. Economically, society is divided into sharply defined social classes and occupations. According to the purely economic point of view, the social ideology is derived from the specific social situation. It follows from this that the specific ideology of a class would more or less have to correspond to the socioeconomic situation of that class. In keeping with their collective working habits, the industrial workers would have to develop a stronger collective feeling, while the small businessmen would have to develop a stronger individualism. The employees of large concerns would have to have a collective feeling similar to that of the industrial workers, but we have already seen that psychic structure and social situation seldom coincide. We draw a distinction between the responsible worker who is conscious of his skills and the mystical nationalistic reactionary subject. We meet with both types in every social and professional class. There are millions of reactionary industrial workers, and there are just as many teachers and physicians who are conscious of their skills and champion the cause of freedom. Hence, there is no simple mechanistic connection between social situation and character structure. The social situation is only the external condition that has an influence on the ideological process in the individual. The instinctual drives through which the various social influences gain exclusive control over the emotions are now to be investigated. To begin with, this much is clear. Hunger is not one of them. At least it is not the decisive factor. If it were, the international revolution would have followed upon the world crisis of 1929 to 33. This is a sound statement, no matter how dangerous it may be to antiquated, purely economic points of view. While psychoanalysts unversed in sociology tried to explain social revolution as an infantile revolt against the father, they have in mind the revolutionary, who comes from intellectual circles. This is indeed the case there. But it does not apply to the industrial workers. The paternal suppression of children among the working class is not less severe. Indeed, it is sometimes more brutal than it is among the lower middle class. This is not the issue. That which specifically distinguishes these two classes is found in their modes of production and the attitude toward sex which derives from these modes. The point is this. Sexuality is suppressed by the parents among the industrial workers also, but the contradictions to which the children of industrial workers are subjected don't exist in the lower middle class. Among the lower middle class, it is only sexuality that is suppressed. The sexual activity of this class is a pure expression of the contradiction between sexual drive and sexual inhibition. This is not the case among the industrial workers. Along with their moralistic ideology, the industrial workers have their own, in some cases more and in others less pronounced, sexual views, which are diametrically opposed to the moralistic ideology. Moreover, there is the influence exercised by the living conditions and their close association in their work. All of this runs counter to their moralistic sexual ideology. Accordingly, the average industrial worker differs from the average lower middle class worker by his open and untrammeled attitude towards sexuality, no matter how muddled and conservative he might be otherwise. He is comparably more accessible to sex economic views than the typical lower middle class worker is. And it is precisely the absence of those attitudes that are central to national socialistic and clerical ideology that makes him more accessible. Identification with the authoritarian state power, with the supreme furor, with the nation. This too is proof of the fact that the basic elements of National Socialist ideology have a sex economic origin. Owing to his individualistic economy and to the extreme isolation of his family situation, the small farmer is very accessible to the ideology of political reaction. This is the reason for the cleavage between social situation and ideology. Characterized by the strictest practice of patriarchy and the morality corresponding to it, the small farmer nonetheless develops natural, even if distorted, forms in his sexuality. Just as in the case of the industrial workers, in contrast to the lower middle class workers, farm youths begin to have sexual intercourse at an early age. Owing to the strict patriarchal education, however, the youth is sexually very disturbed or even brutal. Sexuality is practiced in secret. Sexual frigidity is the rule among girls. Sexual murder and brutal jealousy, as well as enslavement of the women, are typical sexual occurrences among the peasantry. Hysteria is nowhere so rampant as it is in the country. Patriarchal marriage is the final aim of rural upbringing, rigidly dictated by rural economy. An ideologic process has begun to take shape among the industrial workers among the last decades. The material manifestations of this process are most evident in the pure culture of the workers' aristocracy, but they are also to be noted among the average industrial worker. The industrial workers of the 20th century are not the 19th century proletariat of Karl Marx's time. To a very large extent, they have accepted the conventions and views of the bourgeois layers of society. To be sure, formal bourgeois democracy did not eliminate economic class distinctions any more than it did away with racial prejudices. Yet the social tendencies that are gaining ground within its compass have obliterated the structural and ideologic boundaries among the various social classes. The industrial workers of England, America, Scandinavia, Germany are becoming more and more bourgeoisie. To understand how fascism infiltrates the working classes, this process has to be traced from bourgeoisie democracy to the Emergency Powers Act, to the suspension of parliament, to open fascist dictatorship. 2.6. The domestication of the industrial workers. Fascism infiltrates workers' groups from two sides, the so-called lumpen proletariat, an expression to which everyone takes exception, by means of direct material corruption and from the workers' aristocracy, also by means of material corruption as well as ideological influencing. In its political unscrupulousness, German fascism promised everybody everything. In an article by Dr. Jarme, entitled Capitalism, published in the Angriff, September 24th, 1931, we find, quote, at the German National Party rally in Stettin, Hugenberg spoke out against international capitalism with refreshing distinctness. At the same time, however, he stressed the necessity of a national capitalism. In so doing, he once again clearly demarcated the German nationals from the National Socialists. For the latter know only too well that the capitalist economic order, which is in the process of breaking down throughout the world, has to be replaced by a different order, because even in national capitalism there can be no justice. Close quote. That sounds almost communistic. Here we have an example of fascist propaganda appealing directly with a conspicuously fraudulent intention to the revolutionary ardor of the industrial workers. But the crucial question was why the National Socialist industrial workers failed to see that fascism promised everybody everything. It was known that Hitler negotiated with industrial magnates, received financial support from them, and promised an injunction against striking. Thus, it must have been due to the psychological structure of the average worker that such contradictions were not squarely faced, despite the intensive work on the part of the revolutionary organizations to make him conscious of them. In his interview with the American journalist Knickerbocker, Hitler had this to say about the recognition of private debts to foreign countries. Quote, I am convinced that international bankers will soon realize that under a National Socialist government, Germany will be a secure place of investment, that a rate of interest of about 3% will be most willingly paid for credit. Close quote, published in Deutschland zur Heute, page 211. If it were revolutionary propaganda's cardinal task to undeceive the proletariat, this could not have been done solely by appealing to their class consciousness, nor solely by constantly impressing upon them the objective economic and political situation, and certainly not by constantly exposing the frauds that had been practiced on them. The first and foremost task of revolutionary propaganda should have been to give the contradictions in the workers the most sympathetic consideration, to grasp the fact that it was not a clear revolutionary will that was concealed or befogged, but that the revolutionary impulse in the psychic structure of the proletariat was partially underdeveloped and partially interfused with contrary reactionary structural elements. The distillation of the revolutionary sentiments of the broad masses is undoubtedly the basic task in the process of awakening their social responsibility. In times of quiet bourgeoisie democracy, two fundamental possibilities are open to the industrial worker. Identification with the bourgeoisie, which holds a higher position in the social scale, or identification with his own social class, which produces its own anti-reactionary way of life. To pursue the first possibility means to envy the reactionary man, to imitate him, and, if the opportunity arises, to assimilate his habits of life. To pursue the second of these possibilities means to reject the reactionary man's ideologies and habits of life. Due to the simultaneous influence exercised by both social and class habits, these two possibilities are equally strong. The revolutionary movement also failed to appreciate the importance of the seemingly irrelevant everyday habits, indeed very often turned them to that account. This lower middle class bedroom suite, which the rabble buys as soon as he has the means, even if he is otherwise revolutionary minded, the consequent suppression of the wife, even if he is a communist, decent suit of clothes for Sunday, proper dance steps, and 1,000 other banalities, have an incomparably greater reactionary influence when repeated day after day than thousands of revolutionary rallies and leaflets can ever hope to counterbalance. Narrow conservative life exercises a continuous influence, penetrates every facet of everyday life, whereas factory work and revolutionary leaflets have only a brief effect. Thus, it was a grave mistake to cater to the conservative tendencies in the workers by giving banquets as a means of getting at the masses. Reactionary fascism was much more expert at this. The budding revolutionary modes of life were not cultivated. There was more truth about the reactionary structure of the workers in the evening dress bought by the wife of a worker for such a banquet than in 100 articles. The evening dress or at-home beer parties were, of course, only external manifestations of a process in the worker, a testimony of the fact that the groundwork for the reception of National Socialist propaganda was already there. When added to this, the fascists promised the abolition of the proletariat and was successful with this promise. It was the evening dress and not the economic program that accounted for success in 90 of 100 cases. We must pay much more attention to these details of everyday life. It is around these details that social progress, or its opposite, assume concrete forms, not around the political slogans that arouse temporary enthusiasm only. There is important and fruitful work waiting here. In Germany, the revolutionary work for the masses was restricted almost exclusively to propaganda against hunger. The basis of this propaganda, as important as it was, proved to be too narrow. There are thousands of different things taking place behind the scenes in the life of the individuals of the masses. For instance, the young worker has 1,000 sexual and cultural problems, which plague him as soon as he appeased his hunger to a small degree. The fight against hunger is of primary importance, but the hidden processes of human life must also be placed under the fierce light of this monkey show, in which we are spectator and actor at one and at the same time, and this must be done without restraint and without fear of consequences. The working man would undoubtedly show himself to be infinitely creative in his attempts to develop his own conceptions of life and natural way of viewing things. The mastering of everyday social problems would give invincible impetus to the reactionary infested masses. A detailed, concrete, and germane study of these problems is indispensable. It will accelerate and secure the victory of the revolution. And please don't raise the threadbare objection that such proposals are utopian. Only by stressing all possibilities of a work democratic way of life, by taking a militant stance toward reactionary thinking and militantly developing the seed of a living culture of masses of people, can lasting peace be secured. As long as reactionary social irresponsibility predominates over social responsibility, the worker will also be fairly close to revolutionary, an example, rational behavior. This is also another reason psychological work among the masses is so imperative. The degradation of manual labor, which is a basic element of the inclination to imitate the reactionary white-collar worker, constitutes the psychological basis upon which fascism relies as soon as it begins to infiltrate the working classes. Fascism promises the abolition of the classes, that is to say, the abolition of proletarian status, and in this way it plays upon the social inferiority felt by the manual laborer. As long as peasants were still migrating to the city to become workers, they brought along a fresh rural family ideology, which, as we have already shown, is the best soil for the fostering of an imperialistic, nationalistic ideology. In addition to this, there's an ideological process in the workers' movement, which, in the assessment of the chances of a revolutionary movement in countries having a highly developed industry, as well as in those countries whose industry was still undeveloped, has been accorded much too little attention. Kautsky noted that politically, the worker in highly industrialized England was less developed than the worker in industrially undeveloped Russia, published in the Socialism Revolution, second edition, pages 59 and 60. The political events in the various countries of the world during the past 30 years have clearly shown that the revolutionary revolts take more readily in industrially undeveloped countries such as China, Mexico, and India than in countries such as England, America, and Germany. And in this case, notwithstanding the existence of disciplined, well-organized workers' movements rooted in old traditions in the latter countries. If bureaucratization, which is itself a pathological symptom, is abstracted from the workers' movement, the question arises as to the exceptional entrenchment of conservatism in social democracy and in the trade unions in Western countries. From the standpoint of the psychology of the masses, social democracy is based on the conservative structures of its followers. As in the case of fascism, the problem here lies not so much in the policies pursued by the party leadership as it does in the psychological basis in the workers. I want to point out only a few relevant facts, which, however, may well solve a riddle or two. Here are the facts. In early capitalism, besides the sharp economic division between bourgeoisie and proletariat, there was an equally sharp ideologic division, and particularly a structural division. The absence of any kind of social policy, the emasculating 16, indeed 18-hour workday, the low standard of living of the industrial workers, classically described in Engels' Condition of the Working Classes in England, precluded any structural assimilation of the proletariat to the bourgeoisie. The structure of the 19th century proletariat was characterized by a meek submission to fate. The psychological mood of this proletariat, including the peasantry, was one of indifference and apathy. Bourdieu's thinking was lacking. Consequently, this apathy did not hinder the sudden outbreak of revolutionary sentiments. If suitable occasions arose and did not prevent these sentiments from developing to an unexpected intensity and resoluteness. If an organized workers' movement had succeeded in winning socio-political improvements, as shorter working hours, franchise, social security, this had the effect of strengthening the working class, but at the same time a contrary process set in. With the raising of the standard of living, there was a structural assimilation to the middle class. With the elevation of one's social position, one's eyes turned upward. In times of prosperity, allow me to reread. With the raising of the standard of living, there was a structural assimilation to the middle class. With the elevation of one's social position, one's eyes turned upward. In times of prosperity, this adaptation of middle-class habits was intensified. But the subsequent effect of this adaptation in times of economic crisis was to obstruct the full unfolding of revolutionary sentiments. The strength of the social democracies during the crisis years shows just how completely the workers have been infected with this conservatism. Thus, this strength was not to be explained on purely political grounds. It is now important to comprehend its basic elements. Two facts stand out. The emotional tie to the Furor, that is to say, the unshakableness of the faith and the infallibility of the political leadership, notwithstanding all the criticism which never materialized into action, and the sex moralistic assimilation to the conservatism of the lower middle class. This assimilation to the middle class was energetically encouraged by the upper middle class everywhere. Footnote 9, page 72. Following a congress in Leipzig in 1932, I spoke with social democrat workers who had attended the congress about the political crisis. They were in accord with all the arguments against the way to socialism, quote unquote, propagandized by social democracy, but otherwise hardly drew a distinction between themselves and the communists. I asked one of them why they did not proceed accordingly and detach themselves from their leaders. His answer staggered me. That's how inconsistent it was with his previously expressed views. He said, "Our leaders surely know what they are doing." This was an all too clear expression of the contradiction in which the social democrat worker found himself, the tie to the leader, which prevented criticism of his policies from materializing into action. In view of this, it is easier to understand the grave error that was committed when attempting to win over the social democrat worker by reviling his leaders. Since he identified with his leaders, he could only be repelled by such insults. The inner rottenness of German social democracy was clearly brought out in the arrest of Severin, the social democrat minister of the Interior, by a few armed men shortly before Hitler's seizure of power. 12 million social democrats did not prevent it. Footnote 10, page 73. To a large extent, the breakdown of the Norwegian government in 1940 was to be traced back to the same influence exercised by social democratic conservatism. For example, the social democrat government had prohibited military units from holding parades. But in 1939, the Norwegian fascists were the only ones who still marched through the streets and held exercises. Quisling's betrayal was greatly encouraged by such quote-unquote liberalism. The Social Democrats should have literally swung their cudgels. Wilhelm Reich continues. In the beginning, at a time when fascism had not yet attained victory. Instead, they held them in reserve and used them only against the revolutionary workers. For the masses who were Social Democrats, they had a far more dangerous expedient: conservative ideology in all areas. When, then, the social democrat worker found himself in the economic crisis which degraded him to the status of a coolie, the development of his revolutionary sentiments was severely retarded by the conservative structuralization that had been taking shape in him for decades. Allow me to reread this. Two facts stand out. The emotional tie to the Furor, that is to say, the unshakableness of the faith and the infallibility of political leadership, and the sex moralistic assimilation to conservatism of the lower middle class. This assimilation to the middle class was energetically encouraged by the upper middle class everywhere. The Social Democrats should have literally swung their cudgels, in the beginning at a time when fascism had not yet attained victory. Instead, they held them in reserve and used them only against the revolutionary workers. For the masses who were Social Democrats, they had a far more dangerous expedient: conservative ideology in all areas. When, then, the Social Democrat worker found himself in the economic crisis which degraded him to the status of a coolie, the development of his revolutionary sentiments was severely retarded by the conservative structuralization that had been taking shape in him for decades. Either he remained in the camp of the Social Democrats, notwithstanding his criticism and rejection of their policies, or he went over to the NSDAP in search of a better replacement. Irresolute and indecisive, owing to the deep contradiction between revolutionary and conservative sentiments, disappointed by his own leadership, he followed the line of least resistance. Whether he would give up his conservative tendencies and arrive at a complete consciousness of his actual responsibility in the production process, an example, at a revolutionary consciousness, depended solely on the correct or incorrect leadership of the Revolutionary Party. Thus, the communist assertion that it was the social democrat policies that put fascism in the saddle was correct from a psychological viewpoint. Disappointment in social democracy, accompanied by the contradiction between wretchedness and conservative thinking, must lead to fascism if there are no revolutionary organizations. For example, following the fiasco of the Labour Party's policies in England, 1930 to 31, fascism began to infiltrate the workers who then, in the election of 1931, cut away to the right instead of going over to communism. Democratic Scandinavia was also severely threatened by such a development. Rosa Luxemburg took the view that a revolutionary fight was not possible with coolies. What kind of a coolie are we dealing with? The coolie before or after he has gone through conservative structuralization? Beforehand, we are dealing with a coolie who has an almost impenetrable dullness, but also a great capacity for revolutionary action. Afterward, we are dealing with disappointed coolies. Would it not be more difficult to rouse their revolutionary inclinations? How long can fascism exploit the masses' disappointment in social democracy and their rebellion against the system for its own narrow purposes? As difficult as it may be to answer this momentous question, one thing is certain. The international revolutionary movement will have to tackle it if it wants to deal fascism its death blow. The end of chapter 2, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, written by Wilhelm Reich, translated by Vincent R. Carfagna.